Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast. Hello guys, and today we are speaking to Dr Dion Georgiou from the University of Chichester. How are you doing, Dion?
Good, thank you, Jackson. Good to be here.
I'm really glad to have you on the podcast. It's been great working with you the past 3 years, and I'm really excited to talk to you about British footballers' biographies and their effect on British culture after the war.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an article that you've been working on for a while now, isn't it?
Yes, we discussed just how long just before the podcast began. We won't discuss it.
Yeah.
We won't give the exact figures again. Let's just say it has been quite a while. Yes, that I've been working on this topic.
So we're looking at Britain and its cultural structures in the post-war. So what was happening to Britain structurally and institutionally during World War II, and then how was it changing coming out of the World War?
So I would say kind of one of the main impacts of the Second World War was the kind of the level of the insertion of the British state into aspects of everyday life, into kind of controlling people's consumption of food and of goods, and obviously in terms of its ability to kind of conscript people and direct them to particular areas of work, whether that would be serving in the armed forces or other industries. And I think that is, the war sets a precedent for the level of kind of state intervention which is expected and accepted in people's everyday life, not uncontested by any stretch of the imagination, and the kind of the extent to which kind of levels of intervention were accepted during wartime, the extent to which people were willing to tolerate those after the war had finished, and the kind of moral rationale that had gone with them had disappeared, was often a lot more complex, which is an issue, because actually in many ways Britain's economic position immediately after the Second World War is, if anything, at times even more perilous than it had been during the Second World War. So there's kind of rationing of foodstuffs that hadn't been on the ration during the Second World War, for example, as the world kind of faced a global food shortage.
And then one way people were trying to escape from the difficulties of everyday life was through culture. And you know, what shape was the British cultural industry after World War II?
So there'd been kind of various different privations kind of placed upon the various cultural industries during the war, due to kind of shortages of various materials, so in terms of kind of in terms of kind of activity, some were curtailed. So, for example, BBC, which had begun a television broadcasting service during the 1930s, stopped it for the duration of the war. Some publishers found found kind of materials for publishing books harder to come by. Likewise for film companies, the access to actual film, as in not as in the films themselves, but as in the actual reels of film, became more difficult. So in some ways there's a kind of and things like newspapers became shorter, and so there's a real so there's kind of constraints that are placed by the war on cultural industries, and also in terms of kind of although there are times when cinemas are closed. I think during the kind of early on in the war, though they generally stay open. But for example, with football matches, there are kind of quite strong limits placed on attendance. So in many ways, kind of access to culture is again much more regulated, and there are kind of privations that the cultural industries have to deal with, but nonetheless they kind of come through that, and they're kind of able to then, once living standards start to rise after the war, and kind of and particularly as you get into the 1950s, and expend an amount of kind of income that could be expended on life's luxuries, so to speak, massively kind of began to significantly increase for many people. And as a result of that, there was both more money to be spent on leisure, but the expansion of the cultural industries, and with that more competition between cultural industries. So things like football and cinema, which had been extremely successful, suddenly find themselves being challenged for their audience by things like the spread of the increasing take-up of television sets. So it's a period of kind of constraint, followed by this period of growth in the particularly during the 1950s. I think is really important in kind of thinking about how culture is impacted by broader economic circumstances, both during the war and kind of in the wake of it.
And then obviously people have got used to that government intervention, but did the government actually get involved in assisting with cultural growth, or did they do anything to kind of promote it?
You have things like, for example, the entertainments tax, whereby they're literally relying on the people's kind of spending on leisure as a direct contribution to the exchequer. One of the things that they're seen as having kind of doing a favour to the cultural industries is when they actually finally remove this. It's worth recognising this isn't actually something that was introduced during the Second World War. It's something that dates back to the First World War and has kind of remained in place ever since. They do things, for example, in set up various vehicles for supporting, for providing finance for British filmmakers and to kind of encourage the making of films in Britain. This is something which has kind of been revived and continued and changed over various over the subsequent decades. This kind of attempt to grow a viable British cinema, and there's also been things that have done alongside that to try and create an authentically British national cinema. So going right back to the late 1920s, there'd been quotas placed on the minimum amount of British films that could be shown by a cinema, so that a certain portion of the films that they showed that would be distributed and that would be actually showed in cinemas had to be British. So there's a number of steps that governments do take to try and intervene in promoting both the well-being of the cultural industries themselves and also to try and their kind of specific Britishness, which is kind of a real a feature of this period.
And at this point, you see the changing nature of the consumer content and the rise of or creation of ITV. You know, how different or how much were things changing? You know, how different was ITV from BBC, and how different was this new content to the past content?
Well, I think ITV is a really interesting case in that it's set up, or the Independent Television Authority is set up by a piece of government legislation. It's funded by advertising, but there's extremely stringent limits on levels of product placement, clear an emphasis placed on keeping, content and advertising as kind of, as programming and advertising as clearly separate things. There's still kind of limitations, kind of degree of censorship in terms of what they can and can't show. And so even though it's a commercial TV station, it's financed by revenue from advertising rather than from a license fee in the same way that BBC television is. Crucially, it has the kind of same public service ethos at its heart. That the people who are kind of running the ITA are very much kind of establishment figures with experiences of working either careers in British politics or careers running other state run cultural organizations. So it's, even though you have the kind of expansion of I think this is a classic case of whereby you do have a case whereby in the context of the 1950s, you do have an expansion of cultural choice, but it takes place under very specific circumstances, and whereby the level of, it's not simply a case that you have ITV and all of a sudden you have this drastic radicalization of what is shown. Nonetheless, the extra degree of choice, the kind of introduction of a new format, the different imperatives that that kind of advertising does impose, mean that you do start to get a kind of a much more of a variation. And one of the things that kind of the Independent Television Authority encourages, by its very structure, is regionally focused programming, because it's there's not one ITV as there is today, but rather there are a range of different regional broadcasters producing programs which are shown, which people watch locally, and these regional broadcasters have franchises from the ITA. And nonetheless, some of the programming they produce proves popular enough that other regional broadcasters start showing it as well. But a really good example of this is how Granada as the kind of broadcaster for the north and later the northwest, and it provides an opportunity for kind of working class people to work in making and acting in the kind of programming it makes. And of course, a really good example of this is Coronation Street. And this actually is something that then impacts back on the BBC, which reorganises in the late 1960s with a view to producing much more kind of regionally focused content. So it's not as straightforward as kind of, here comes commercial television and here come a load of commercial imperatives. But nonetheless, it does change the kind of, it's an example of how economic changes and kind of political changes, in this case, the move from a Labour government that was opposed to commercial television to a Conservative one that was supportive of it, create circumstances whereby culture changes. But it's important to recognise that culture has its own autonomy. That it's not simply the case that you have as soon as you get a Conservative government, you therefore have a commercial TV broadcast reporting. You therefore have much more kind of economically right-wing material being produced on television. It's a much more kind of complex process. It's more about the spaces that these that kind of open up, and so often the way that economic and political change impacts upon cultural change can sometimes be paradoxical, can be quite surprising, but nonetheless it does certainly, I think, open up a space for a less deferential culture, in the way that it produces an opportunity for, particularly as we come into the 1960s, for kind of more anti-establishmentarian voices and thinkers and creatives to become involved in filmmaking, in making television programming, and so on.
And then, obviously, your article's not just about culture. It's also the structures of culture. It's also about football, and to understand where the football was at that point, you have to kind of look at how football was organised, because whilst many of our listeners and our viewers would understand how football is organised now, it wasn't organised the same way.
Yeah, it's a much more, what I would say, a kind of closed political economy of football in the sense of the kind of the relationship between the kind of those institutions which had authority within the organisation of football, so the Football Association and the Football League for a start, but also the kind of clubs themselves, and they kind of operate I would say, kind of far more controlling approach, including even to kind of opportunities for commercialisation. There's a degree of scepticism, but also over kind of the opportunities for the players too. And so it's an era whereby the differences between between clubs at the top, in the top division, and further down in, say, in what was then Division 4, what we would now, the kind of equivalent now is obviously League 2, that the kind of level of division between them that we've seen grow since the advent of the Premiership in the early 1990s, obviously at that time isn't there. You have the Football League runs the entirety of the league. So there's a greater degree of egalitarianism within it, but at the same time, there's no automatic promotion into Division 4. You have to be elected by league members to join the division, and they have to, in doing so, make the decision usually to expel an existing member. And obviously, a system like that is quite prone to not admitting new football clubs. So again, this is something that only happens in the 1980s, whereby you finally get the establishment of the football conference and the establishment of a kind of genuine pyramid of football, whereby there's kind of a way into the league system, a clear way into the league system, which is designed to be meritocratic. So I think that's a really good example of the nature of football, about the way, the kind of constraints. We might also think about kind of restrictions that are placed on broadcasting, so football, like other sports, had seen things like the BBC as a potential threat to its audience, that people, if they started listening to matches on the radio or later watching matches on television, would not come along to games. That was the concern. So it engages in the kind of forms, in broad engagement with the world of broadcasting, relatively slowly and cautiously. The same with the world of gambling, and it's only until in the 1950s that it kind of strikes up a relationship with the pools companies. I think it's the 1950s, and this is a period of a very kind of gradual opening up. But one of the ways that I think particularly interests me in terms of the way we think about the closed political economy of football is the restrictions that are placed on players earning power in the form of a maximum wage and their ability to move clubs with the retain and transfer system, whereby you could, if your contract ran out, you couldn't just up sticks and move to a different club. You were required to stay with the club on kind of the terms it offered you, or if they were willing to transfer you. And so there's very strong restrictions on both players' earning power and then their freedom of movement. The maximum wage is abolished after the players take strike action in the early 1960s. I'm sure that's something we'll come back to. The maximum, the way the retain and transfer system kind of suffers its first really severe blow with the case of George Eastham, an England international who ended up having a severe dispute with his club Newcastle, who promptly refused to sell him, and basically he had to temporarily leave the game and work in another field until Newcastle finally agreed to sell him to Arsenal. And then he sues, nonetheless, with the PFA's backing, he sues Newcastle United. And you have the first time. This is interesting because actually the retain and transfer system was always potentially in breach of the kind of wider employment law and wider laws, but it had never been effectively challenged in court before. There had been attempts to make it, and it had gone kind of disastrously wrong in the pre-First World War periods. And so for a long time, this system, which was incredibly restrictive in ways that might have been in breach of employment law, isn't effectively challenged within a court of law until the 1960s. And it's from there on in, it's kind of modified. the big change, obviously, that we see is not until the 1990s with the introduction of the Bosman ruling, and then it becomes the norm that once your contract runs out, you can move to a different club. There's nothing to stop you from signing for another club once your contract has run out, unless although if you're with younger players, they have to be compensated. So that's a massive change. But going back to the kind of the 1950s and going back to this period before you start to first see these kind of real liberalizations of constraints on players start to be lifted from the 1960s. It's a much more controlled, forcibly egalitarian, I would say, in terms of its kind of, at least the extent to which it tries to maintain a level playing field between clubs by making sure that the financial power of individual football clubs can't be directly turned into signing all the best players, because there are restrictions on how much they can pay them. There are restrictions on the ease with which players can move. And so it's about trying to maintain the Football League as a kind of competitive entity and maintaining the well-being of the clubs within it, not necessarily those who are just outside of it, and certainly not necessarily the players who are, after all, the people who are bringing, that fans are turning up to watch, who are effectively the revenue earners for the game, but they're subjected to kind of constraints on their ability to maximize their value in terms of their playing career by these restrictions that are imposed by the footballing authorities.
So what we're seeing is a largely dominant FA and league system that's incredibly restrictive, and it doesn't seem like these clubs are being operated like a normal business at the time.
No, so we often think about businesses in terms of, what a business is there for, to make profits and to kind of maximize those profits. But I think also we need to consider the extent to which businesses as organizations are also kind of committed to their own continued existence, and to fulfilling other objectives as well. And because the people who are running the clubs often don't necessarily see them as ways of making huge amounts of money for themselves, and often clubs remain in, there's often kind of long-standing family connections and ownership of clubs, that the kind of that profit motive is that profit motive isn't necessarily so clearly directly an influence on the way that clubs behave. And so often they treat what we might see as kind of money-making opportunities of the sort that clubs now will absolutely leap upon. At that point, they don't necessarily see them as good things for the game. And it's a reminder that obviously that the people who run businesses are people, and their own kind of political and moral beliefs, and their own kind of attitudes towards the sector they work in. I think there's a tendency sometimes that we assume that people run a cultural industry. They know what the audience want, and it's all dictated by the consumer. And actually, I think we need to. That's a really kind of simplistic way of thinking about it. And actually, the extent to which people who run businesses interpret what the consumer wants through their own worldview, and in keeping with their own principles and their own interests. And so that explains much of the way that kind of football clubs are run at this time, and the way that the extent to which the level of commercialization of the game is kind of kept at bay by those people running the clubs, those people running the Football Association, for whom professionalism was in itself a compromise that they had made, and then of also the Football League as well, which isn't an organisation representing the entirety of football clubs in the country, but rather a small select elite of them. Even if you're kind of way down in Division 4, you're still part of that broader elite of football clubs.
And this seems particularly poignant at the time, or in recent history, where club owners aren't or were trying to do things what they saw as for the good of the game, and we've seen that recently with the European Super League. But at this point, we're seeing a growing internationalisation of the game. So where does British or English football fit within that growing internationalism?
Yeah, I should stress, actually, we're talking about British football. I'm talking very much about the kind of the English league. I'm not familiar enough, by my own admission, with the kind of rules around the Scottish league. There are a lot of kind of parallels in the way that it's run, in the way that football is set up in the different in the 4 home nations, including this kind of Football Association, Football League split. But in terms of the impact that that has had, and the kind of internationalisation of the game. So one of the things that happens in the immediate wake of the Second World War, shortly after the Second World War, is that the English, Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish football associations that had left FIFA in the late 1920s rejoin. And in the 1950 World Cup, you see them qualifying to participate for the first time. You also have, because of the kind of economic recoveries taking place in European countries, who in many ways experienced a far greater kind of level of destruction than Britain did, but their economies do under both kind of Marshall Plan directed capitalism or kind of Soviet influenced communism. Their economies do recover, and it creates a context whereby you can have a decent standard of football being played by people who are, to all intents and purposes, professionals, whether they're openly professional, as is in the case of Western Europe, or they have, and it would be very complex to try and go and explain the kind of structures of socialist sports at this time, but basically, whereby clubs are owned by state, or by various different state organs, and those players are, in theory, paid for jobs that they do for that state organ, and they just happen to incidentally play football. The reality is that they're not really, they're not really working for directly as for kind of in factories or in the army, but they're playing football for their living. But either way, with either of those systems, they're both earning enough, and football's becoming a viable enough and lucrative enough kind of industry that you can start to have whereby the question of the possibility of having regular football matches between different clubs from different countries is something that becomes feasible as a regularized thing. So there are moves towards this going right back to the interwar period, and even before that, but certainly during the 1930s you start to see kind of fairly regularized competitions being played on sort of smaller scales, or kind of recurring friendly matches between clubs that have kind of good relationships with each other from different countries, and also overseas tours at the end of seasons. But it's only in the 1950s that you start getting, initially under the kind of under the urgings of the French football magazine L'Equipe, to set up an international club competition between the various different leading teams of Europe, who had previously kind of been instead meeting in friendly matches, and there would be debates over who's the best club team in the world, and famous matches between, for example, Wolves and Honved. And it's L'Equipe who kind of see this as something that could be that, who advocate the setting up of a a European Cup competition for the first time. And UEFA, which has actually been set up really to effectively with a view to kind of running, among other things, with a view to running what was then the European nation, what would become the European Nations Cup, what we've now just seen the European Championships. We've been set up really with a view to setting up an organisation, with a view to setting up a cup competition for national sides within Europe, as a part of FIFA. But once this initiative takes place to set up a degree of a football club competition, it's something that UEFA kind of feels the need to take over, to take control over, and kind of accepts it and supports it. Subsequently, then introduces the Cup Winners' Cup. Meanwhile, you have the Fairs Cup being introduced, which isn't run by UEFA. It's kind of linked to broader international cultural festivals taking place within different cities, and it's only in the 1970s whereby that's taken over by UEFA and becomes the UEFA Cup. So it's something which kind of, again, the impetus for it isn't actually necessarily from the kind of football's organisers themselves on an international level, but is rather something that is kind of driven by kind of actors beyond the organisation of football in the form of things like the football press.
Okay, well, and it's quite interesting to watch that develop and to see what's going on within that time. But with this growing internationalisation of football, is Britain sitting behind tactically? Are they as good as Europe?
I think certainly in the late 1940s, you have a really good England team who go and who kind of go about playing friendlies and really highlighting their ability. But it's once you start getting into the 1950s and you start having international competitions at the level of shortcoming of British football relative to the caliber being played in South America and in continental Europe starts to become apparent, whereby these teams, they're not doing as well in the World Cup. But even pretty early on in that, you have the kind of real confirmation of just how far British football is falling behind the other leading lights of the world game, with the arrival of the superb wonder team of Hungary in the early 1950s, who beat England 6-3 at Wembley in 53, and then 7-1, still England's record defeat, in 1954. They also comfortably beat Scotland, I think, at Hampden as well, to reinforce the point. And so there's a real kind of the performance, particularly of England, but also of Scotland at World Cups in the 1950s, starts to really kind of shatter this myth of British superiority sport. Wales and Northern Ireland don't actually do quite well in the 58 World Cup, and so do British football's reputation a great deal more good. But nonetheless, it's the case, and there's a slow acceptance that initially there's a kind of tendency to almost sort of, given the stylistic differences between the British game and the game that's being played on the continent, to make excuses to say, oh well, they play a different sort of game to us. I wouldn't say it's necessarily better, or they say, oh yeah, well, kind of collectively they're very capable, but individually the British footballer has got more ability, or they say, none of these players can play it compared to the great footballers of the interwar period. And so all sorts of kind of excuses are made, but eventually it's fairly clear by the start of the 1960s, whereby you have got regular international and club competition, and they're not being won by British sides. They're being won by Spanish teams or by Portuguese teams, and World Cups are being won by the likes of Brazil and Uruguay, and not by British teams. And then it's obviously there's a kind of change of fortunes in the mid to late 1960s, whereby England wins the World Cup in '66. Celtic wins the European Cup in '67, followed by Manchester United in '68. Already in the early 1960s, I think you have, I forget exactly when, I think it might be 62 or 63, whereby you have the first victory in a European competition, but as in a club actually winning a cup, when Spurs win the Cup Winners' Cup, rather. And so you kind of get towards a period, and then you come into the 1970s and into the late 1970s, where whereby British clubs really come much more into their own in terms of their competitiveness, and you have you also have Rangers winning the Cup Winners' Cup. You have multiple different English sides winning the European Cup, and so there's a kind of shift in fortunes. Although it's actually at a period of time whereby British national teams are not doing well. You know, England fails to qualify for the '74 and '78 World Cups. Scotland qualifies but goes out in the first round, and so there's a kind of the recognition sinks in, I would say, a lot earlier, in a kind of narrative of superiority to a narrative of, well, there's reasons why we're not beating them, to a kind of narrative of why are we just not as good, and this idea of the continental footballer and the English footballer as kind of two different types. The idea that the British footballer is the superior, very quickly starts to kind of shift towards a recognition that actually that players like Pele, for example, are, he's not continental, he's from Brazil, but this kind of idea that these players are smarter and cleverer and more able, maybe more cunning, than the British footballer becomes something that becomes embedded, and it's something that persists, I would say, towards the present day. Simon Cooper in his 1993 book Football Against the Enemy writes about this categorization of this kind of differences between the continental footballer and the British footballer, and these various stereotypes, and talking about how Gaza at that point in time overturned some of these in his style of play, but the extent to which that kind of idea that the British footballer is a separate type from the European one, and actually that's not an attractive comparison, starts to kind of settle into British football discourse after the Second World War, once you start to get these kind of regularised competitions, and British teams are not, with some periods of success, but at times the extent to which they are behind the teams, the world's best football teams, both at club and international level, starts to become fairly clear.
And building on that, like you just said, we are seeing that stereotype kind of eroding away, with mainly the exception of Burnley. We are still seeing that erosion of what a British footballer is. But then at this point, we see stars being born with the cultural expansion of football, and the expansion of football and players being like household names. And they start writing autobiographies. So when did these first? No,
I was going to say, when they start writing autobiographies, obviously it's got. But the first kind of footballer's autobiography is start to appear kind of around about the end of the Second World War, where often they're kind of players who were already big names before the before the Second World War. So in many cases, it's players who had already kind of established their stardom earlier, and who, with the expansion of the publishing industry, see an opportunity to cash in on their stardom. Or rather, it's often, a really interesting case, and one that we know a fair bit about because he's written about it, is Brian Glanville. And Brian Glanville, having been a childhood Arsenal fan, recognised the opportunities there to potentially be made, for money to be made, and he speaks to both the publisher and also to the now veteran Arsenal player Cliff Bastin, and offers to ghostwrite his autobiography. And so you start to see this this kind of relationship develop, whereby a financial opportunity arises for both football journalists and for footballers to co-produce these autobiographies, and this is facilitated by the re-expansion of the publishing industry after the Second World War, and by the extent to which it's starting to recognise the existence of potential new audiences. One of which is, working class adults, also children, who might be interested in reading about the lives of these players. And so you start to see a real they start to become much more common as you get into the late 1940s, and then they remain at a pretty high level throughout the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, with the kind of various successes of these of British teams in both club and the international game, you start to see a real kind of flooding of the market with these kind of autobiographies. So it's something that really, that footballers' autobiographies aren't a genre that exists in Britain prior to the Second World War. It's something that very, very quickly becomes a growth area in the 40s and 50s, and it's something that we have to recognise through this prism, whereby the extent to which footballers' opportunities to make money through actually just playing football is constrained by the maximum wage, and so other opportunities for making revenue through things like endorsements, participating in advertising, but also through, for example, the royalties that come with having a book published in your name, become much more become a kind of an attractive option, and so this is how this kind of process comes into starts to come into effect, and you start getting more and more footballers' autobiographies with various levels of input from the players, and the extent to which, what is the footballer and what is the writer, is often a difficult one to kind of separate. I think you kind of have to see them as a co-authorial voice, really, in the extent to which even if the words are mostly the choice of the ghostwriter, nonetheless, it's the footballer's life, it's the footballer's story, it's their permission that needs to be given in order to tell it, and so it's a co-narrativization, really, of their sporting careers.
And then,
sorry.
I was just about to say, these autobiographies, are they all giving independent kind of narratives, or are they all enforcing a certain stereotype of which people have about the footballers?
Yeah, there's one of the people who's written about footballers' autobiographies is Joyce Woolridge, and she talks about there being kind of these is kind of about the sort of the way that the British football autobiography develops as a genre, and she kind of periodizes it with, and I broadly agree with this, that there's kind of a period whereby the first footballers' stories that come out are typified by people like Stanley Matthews, and these are kind of ideal life stories. And they're kind of the idea that this is actually that these people are the embodiment of a meritocratic Britain, but also a people who offer a healthy example for other people to learn from in their kind of approach to their careers, and so it's the kind of the ideal sporting life kind of narrative. And then from the 1950s, you start to see more and more kind of autobiographies that we might call kind of bad boy of sport stories. So people like Len Shackleton, who had a kind of reputation as a kind of sporting as a maverick on the field, kind of writes his autobiography. Trevor Ford, who'd been suspended for taking under the counter payments and had generally been an incredibly controversial figure on the field, as well as a kind of rough and tumble centre forward. He publishes his autobiography, and so you kind of have a period now whereby it's this kind of this sort of. It's important to recognise that you still get these kind of these ideal sporting life narratives continue to be published, but they now coexist with whereby a footballer doesn't have to have lived an exemplary life or have a kind of exemplary life story to tell. They can also be kind of telling a warts and all story of the game. And then a third narrative which starts to appear is kind of in the 1970s. You get much more kind of confessional autobiographies talking about the kind of real difficult times in their life. And Jimmy Greaves, for example, his autobiography published in the, I think in the very early 1980s, kind of details it pretty extensively his decline into alcoholism in pretty kind of fairly, you know, I remember reading it as a teenager, and you know, kind of reading some of the stories and the extent to which the lengths he would go to get to have a drink in really, really strikingly kind of no holds barred sort of approach, which is very, very different to the kind of narrative that had been told in the kind of autobiographies of the likes of Stanley Matthews in the late 1940s. So yes, you do have you do have these three broad types, and you do have this real kind of shift, and it correlates right with the shifting reputation of the footballer and who are the kind of dominant types. And once you get into the 1970s, it's kind of very much the sort of the mavericks, the kind of people like Rodney Marshes and Frank Worthingtons, you know, people who've got a reputation for kind of both hard living off the field as well as kind of ostentatious displays of kind of footballing skill on the pitch, and so these kind of shifts in footballers' autobiographies and the sort of generic structures that they follow are very much kind of connected to these broader shifts in kind of footballers' reputations, which in itself also has a lot to do with the kind of those changes that had taken place in the early 1960s with the kind of abolition of the maximum wage. And it's interesting, you kind of clearly see this in the narratives of the footballers' autobiographies. Once you come into the mid to late 1960s, they often talk about the kind of the perks that the game has given them, and the financial benefits that had gone with it, and the extent to which they're able to build a good life for them and their families. And that's very much, and they recognise that, you know, that this wouldn't necessarily have been possible had it not been for the abolition of the maximum wage. And so these players who tend to be generally amongst the kind of elite players, international players, the best players for their clubs, who tend to be top division clubs, and so they're the people who benefit the most from the kind of abolition of the maximum wage, and so they're able to tell this story of greater prosperity, and obviously that combined with cultural changes in the 1960s and 70s, all of these kind of combined to make possible a very different narrative of the footballer's life, which revolves around kind of a degree of hedonism off the pitch often, and talking about kind of their sexual exploits, their kind of their love of drinking or gambling, and these stories become part of their the kind of the sort of standard footballing autobiography, and that's down to these kind of shifts that are taking place both within the game, within other cultural industries like publishing, and then more broadly within Britain itself.
And then, so a lot of them are exposing how their life is and how their life has changed. But do any of these autobiographies kind of expose or highlight any of the wrongs in the British game compared to the foreign game, and then do these lead to any changes within the game at home?
It's hard to see whether they lead to any changes, but they often provide a commentary on the shortcomings of the British game. Again, it's difficult to know whether these are the narratives of footballers themselves, or whether these are sports journalists who have their own agendas that they're writing. What's striking though is that when they're talking about particularly in the 40s and 50s, when you start to get this narrative about this is what I do, this is what my career entails, this is what I'm paid, I should be paid more, there shouldn't be these ceilings on what I can earn. And so it's hard to see how those details about my spending power and my earning power, and this parallels what the kind of arguments that are being put out by the Professional Footballers Association, and that also and details fairly extensively these kind of players' contractual arrangements, in a way that makes it fairly obvious that this is definitely, to a large degree, the players' input into these narratives is visible, and they are often very critical, particularly of the kind of the limits that are placed. In some cases, they discuss moves abroad, like the case of John Charles, the Wales and Leeds centre back / centre forward, who moves to Juventus, and his autobiography, in many ways, is a justification of his move to Juventus, and talks about the kind of the financial constraints that had existed on his spending power as a player in England, and how that changed when he moved over to Italy, where Italian football wasn't necessarily wealthier than English football, but rather the wealth that was concentrated at the top of the game, and the lack of kind of similar restrictions on payments to players, meant that you could make a great deal more as a star player in Italy than you could in England. So there is a lot of kind of discussion of the state of the game and what needs to be done to put English or British football back up where it belongs. So there's still this kind of narrative of the whole idea that we gave the game to the world, and we played it first and we played it best, and how do we get back to our back where we belong kind of narrative. But there's also these come alongside really fairly extensive criticism about the way that the game is run, and about the way that its kind of wealth is shared out, and the amount that kind of top players are able to get out of the game.
And then they're criticising the game, but it seems there was very little criticism of international situations such as the Cold War, when these players are going over to the East. So that they're encountering issues within their own game and saying, I'm not paid enough. But when it comes to these cultural issues, are they getting involved, or those political issues, are they getting involved in them?
Yeah, they tend to be. I think particularly in the whereby there's a lot more kind of intrigue to trips overseas because they're not quite as regularized. Players' accounts of their experiences going overseas are a lot more of a kind of big deal, especially when they go, especially in the 1950s, whereby Cold War relations are still fairly tense, whereby kind of there hasn't been a sort of normalization of relations, and so what's going on in the Eastern Bloc still remains, something of a mystery. So you do get these kind of narratives about, my strange trip to Moscow, and kind of accounts of it. Often, what they tend to talk about is sometimes about the kind of the amazingness of the footballing facilities that exist in Eastern Bloc countries, and the quality of the teams. But it's often used kind of set against the kind of narratives of the poorer quality of life in Eastern Europe, the kind of the political situation there, the lack of freedom. There's often a lot of discussion about the kind of about poor quality living accommodation, about negative experiences of kind of flying in, whereby their kind of aircraft had come into contact with communist countries' fighter planes that kind of, if they'd come out of their air corridors. So it's the kind of narrative of the trip to Eastern Europe is often one which is kind of surrounded with intrigue and often replicates quite a lot of negative stereotypes about life in communist countries and the kind of political situation, the economic situation, even as they might praise the teams that they encounter there, and the quality of facilities they have. So you have kind of often sitting side by side, you have these sorts of negative stereotypes and kind of and typical negative narratives about life in the Eastern Bloc on the one hand, but also these narratives about communist advancement and about the kind of this is the time of Sputnik, and whereby the Soviets seem to have the lead in the space race, and whereby there's a perception at this point in time which is rapidly kind of disproved, but it's a perception that actually the Soviets are leading the world and kind of offer a vision of what the future is going to be like. And so you have these kind of narratives of sporting advancement sitting alongside narratives of broader political backwardness. It's interesting because some people do feel the need when they're writing about the game to kind of present an ambassadorial stance and sort of say, oh, these politics have nothing to do with me. It's Billy Wright's autobiography is kind of his sort of status as England captain as a kind of gentleman of the game means that his autobiography is very diplomatic about life in those countries. Others are a lot more scathing. Tom Finney's, for example, is very negative. And again, we might question, to what extent is this kind of advocacy of kind of capitalist economic systems and the standard of life it facilitates? To what extent is this coming from the football writers themselves, who are kind of regurgitating tropes from journalism, from other genres? Certainly a lot of it, but at the same time, a lot of these players are actually people who are involved in initiatives to maximize their own income. Everything that they're kind of doing off the pitch is actually, a lot of the things they're doing, kind of opening their own shops. They do have to be quite entrepreneurial, and they're also involved in a trade union movement that is nonetheless a trade union movement which is about making more money for relatively well-paid workers, to kind of maintain their differential in terms of income from the ordinary factory worker. So there's reasons to kind of suspect that whilst there's a this kind of this dislike of the politicization of the game that they see communist countries as undertaking, and of the these narratives of the kind of standard of living, many of which kind of regurgitate stereotypes from other from fiction and from film and from the media about kind of life in Eastern Bloc countries. Nonetheless, I find it tempting to think that actually this particularly kind of the extent to which they don't just I would say they don't these aren't just kind of narratives that kind of fit the Britain of the 40s and 50s, a country whose kind of broader economic model at that time is social democratic, even under conservative governments, whereby this is a country whereby actually which is becoming more equal, whereby trade unions play a large part in life, but also that is still quite establishmentarian, whereby there's still there's still kind of it's becoming more equal, but still one where class differences are marked, and where and which is still quite paternalistic in a lot of ways. Whereas Footballers' Autobiographies I would describe as much more proto-Thatcherite in many ways, that they're kind of their narratives about meritocracy and demanding that they be paid and kind of defend, and then once they do start getting paid the amount of money they believe they should be, they start defending it. And this feeds into their narratives about kind of Eastern Bloc life, which basically are very pro-capitalist in their arguments. And so it's, on the one hand, this is kind of coming out of the Cold War divide as it exists between Britain and the Eastern Bloc, but at the same time, it also shows the extent to which the instability of the kind of British social and cultural and economic order of the time, the extent to which it was contingent, I think. And so it's interesting how this, I think Footballers' Autobiographies are a really good example of the kind of paradoxes of British culture, that the kind of impact of greater prosperity, which is achieved under as part of kind of broader global economic conditions, but which is distributed relatively evenly by historical comparisons, under as part of as I said, as part of a kind of political economy that we could broadly describe as relatively social democratic, between kind of the period between 45 and 79. And it creates opportunities for people from working class backgrounds to kind of to tell their stories and to kind of and to contribute to culture. But paradoxically, that also creates a space for people to kind of tell narratives which kick against the establishment, kick against also kind of the norms of Britain during this period, in ways which ultimately, I would argue, serve to undermine it. They serve to kind of, I'm not going to attribute the rise of Margaret Thatcher to Jimmy Hill, but I think there's clearly a kind of a paving of the way in many of these narratives. It kind of, I think it creates a space whereby these narratives can kind of multiply and circulate, which are critical of the norms of the kind of social and economic norms of the day. The social and economic norms which actually arguably create the space in which footballers' voices can be heard, and whereby Footballers' Autobiographies have become a product that people want to buy. So I think it's slightly paradoxical in that sense, and it kind of, again, I think it highlights the extent to which we do have to think about the kind of autonomy of the cultural field, and the extent to which that kind of political and social and economic changes that take place beyond the kind of the realm of cultural production will shape the way in which culture is produced, but they won't necessarily shape its it won't directly shape its outcomes necessarily. It won't determine the way that it won't determine the nature of the culture that is produced. But the culture that is produced can produce new narratives that challenge the particular economic and political and social structures, and thus can drive kind of changes in them. So I think it's an interesting relationship. I think it's one that doesn't necessarily work out always in the way that you would think it is. So I think that's one of the things I find most fascinating about these footballers' autobiographies. Is in many ways they're both a product of the post-war era, but they're also a harbinger of the dismantlement of that kind of dominant of the world that of the kind of world of post-war Britain, and that particular, what we might call the post-war settlement, and everything that kind of underpinned it. Footballers' autobiographies are both a product of that era, but they're also kicking against it in ways that we can kind of foresee some of the narratives that would become politically dominant during the 1970s and certainly into the 1980s and beyond.
And it's particularly interesting that today we're perhaps seeing a return of that cycle with players like Marcus Rashford putting out new books and new autobiographies. But now a final fun question for you, Dion. Now, I know you are a massive Arsenal fan, like myself.
Yes.
Who are your 3 favourite players, past or present?
Like Bergkamp Henry. I think that's a fairly...
Can't go wrong there.
Yeah. It kind of speaks to my particular generation. So Ian Wright was the first footballer I kind of idolised growing up in the 1990s. He basically was the entire... basically at a time when Arsenal weren't particularly good. I think it's fair to say the fact that we still had a striker who was capable of getting 30 plus goals a season, and he was such an as he is as a pundit now, he was such an engaging personality on the pitch as well, and the equally capable of scoring tap-ins or banging them in from 30 yards and taking the goalkeeper by surprise. And then obviously I was fortunate enough to be a teenager at the point where Arsenal's strike force consisted of Bergkamp and Henry, and two utterly incredible players who it was an absolute privilege to kind of, for the sort of, at the point in time where it really does matter to you just how well your football team is doing. Yeah. I was pretty well blessed in just how good they were at that point in time. It's easier to deal with Arsenal being not quite so good when you're once you're into your 30s and you have other things to worry about. But kind of when you're in your late teens, the football really is the be all and end all. I was quite lucky that the be all and end all was pretty good as it was at the time.
You are incredibly lucky coming from someone else that's seen us win a league title.
Yes, yeah, we've had better periods. Although we've had worse ones as well during my own lifetime that I can also attest to. So.
And if our listeners would like to interact with any of the topics that we have spoke about today, what would you recommend that they go away and look at or read?
People whose work I would recommend looking at, so on footballers' autobiographies, particularly Joyce Wooldridge, on football more broadly, during the and kind of history of British football more generally, Professor Matthew Taylor at De Montfort University, his work on obviously we've ranged quite widely. I wonder whether it would be better actually, because I do want to kind of to genuinely give a shout out to every person whose kind of work I've paraphrased. But there's been a lot, so I think what I might do is send you a kind of a reading list, if that would be all right, to kind of to put up with the podcast, to sort of recommendations for people to do reading if they're interested about stuff like that. But certainly Joyce Wooldridge's Work, Matt Taylor's work on post-war British football. Who else? People like Jim Tomlinson's work on and also Jim Phillips's work on kind of like on the political economy of Britain during this period, and so that, yeah, there's quite a few people whose work I would certainly recommend, kind of relating to the different things that we've talked about. So yeah, those are some names to get started with, but I'll send you a kind of a not a lengthy but a short reading list of people who are kind of interested in various topics that we've touched upon today, their work to have a read of.
And I make sure they are in the description for all our listeners below, just to make sure that they can get a copy for themselves. And then finally, if our listeners want to keep up to date with you online, where can they find you?
On Twitter, usually moaning, but generally, at Dr Dion Georgiou. Good thing about having a relatively unusual Greek name is that it's much easier to kind of get the Twitter handles and emails that you want. I guess Twitter would be the first point of contact. So yeah, I'm at Dr Dion Georgiou. Is my Twitter handle, and yeah, that's the best place to find me. I think if you're kind of interested in my work, and if you want to hear plenty of moaning about Arsenal, it's also a good place to look.
Hopefully this season's a bit more praise.
Yeah. No, I'm relatively. I'm sanguine. I'm not. I'd say I was optimistic, but I'm sanguine. I treat fortune and misfortune with Arsenal with the same kind of worldview now.
The best descriptor is an Arsenal fan. That's
yes, I think yeah. Although I'm not sure. I'm not angry enough anymore. I think when it comes to I don't rage over a teenager being sent on loan who should be at the first team. I find that slightly strange. But anyway.
Well, thank you very much, Dion. Thank you very much for coming on the History of Jackson podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely chatting to you about this topic, one that I know that we're both strongly interested in. We've talked about before during term time, but it's been nice to have a real kind of thorough chat about it today.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you.